Hello. Thank you for tuning in to my conversation with Michael Porcelli. So, Mr. Porcelli is a really good friend of mine. We go back quite a long time. And as he introduces himself, and I talk a little bit about in the beginning of the video. So he has a lot of background in the human potential movement, and also as a computer engineer, and can really kind of tell his experience and his adept attention on matters of culture and education and designing it. And you can tell he's done a lot of thinking about this. So I wanted to bring him on and have what will probably be the first of many discussions. We talk a lot about cultural development, language and its role as in education. We talk a lot about how is it that one can learn and how to teach deep cultural kinds of issues, right? Around things like emotional attunement, authentic communication in corporate settings and professional settings, and how all of that works and comes together both technically and philosophically and in terms of our time. So cover a lot about the history of communication and of thinking and all kinds of stuff. So this was really a rich conversation. So it'll be the first of many. So thank you for joining in. We also talk a lot about circling, and so here that leads into some housekeeping. So I have the Circling Institute. If you are interested in learning more about circling, we have the Art of Circling year-long practitioner training. It's open for registration right now. It's a deep dive into everything we're talking about on this video. We also have open events on Thursday, and I think we have a weekend coming up, a weekend circling intensive in about a month or so. I also do one-on-one coaching as well. So my email and all the links are below. All right. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, I'm recording on my local thing here.
Okay, cool.
On the Zoom, I'm recording locally. Hey, Guy.
Mr. Porcelli. Welcome to my computer screen. And I welcome myself to yours. We've been planning on this for a while, and we just haven't gotten around to it. So I'm really super excited about this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too.
Many through the years, and all these different touch points and realms of interest that we're involved in. And I actually first met you. I think the first time I met you is when I circled you, right? It was at a course.
Yep.
That was involved, like one of the processes was, the main process was circling. Mm-hmm. And I think I led your first circle, wasn't it?
You and our friend Kevin, our mutual friend Kevin.
There we go.
Led my first circle, and where I got my circle-y virginity popped on 10th Street in downtown San Francisco.
In San Francisco, yeah. And then you went on and you ended up, well, you also brought with you a bunch of experience, right? And one of the things you've gone on and got really involved with circling and with authentic relating and all that. And I'll give you a chance to talk about all the things that you've been involved in historically. Mm-hmm. The thing I've always appreciated about you, right, is that I've found it relatively rare, right, for in this world to have somebody who's simultaneously open in their heart, mm-hmm. And intensely intellectually interested in all of this, right? And I've always really appreciated that about you, the depth of your curiosity and your sense of wonderment about all things all
Mm-hmm.
things will say cultural human development, right? Including the history. So after dealing with some technical difficulties, I'll just pick up, I think, where I left off. But what I was saying is, Porch is I have found you to be somebody who is not only deeply heart centered, right, and relational in all the ways that we strive for in circling,
Mm-hmm.
but also you have a particular openness, right, to the underlying um, ideas and philosophies that bring forth transformation, that bring forth human development. And so I've watched you throughout your life get more articulate with that, more involved in relationships, more involved in companies and starting companies and communities of practice. And I've always really appreciated the depth of your knowledge and your curiosity and your ability to make distinctions about this stuff, which is really difficult and much needed. So I'm super happy. I'm super happy with this conversation and have you officially part of the conversation here on YouTube.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad to be here, man.
Mm-hmm. So I think it'd probably be good just for everybody, just for you to talk about yourself a little bit, about what some of your history that has you come up and be interested in all the things that you're doing. I know that you've just started a podcast. You're doing a bunch of work, doing some work that involves like corporate culture
Mm-hmm.
and so much more. So if you can just give a little background, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated you reflecting back the mind and the heart kind of aspects of myself. It does feel like something I resonate with, identify with, and I could think all the way back, like kind of where's the roots of this. It's like, well, I had a dad who's an Italian, but he's an engineer, and a mom, who was immigrant from Mexico, and I was raised in a kind of sort of Pentecostal Christian environment where there was a lot of like heart open devotional style, praise and worship, and like raised to basically, follow in my father's footsteps and become an engineer at Hewlett Packard, which I did. My undergraduate degree was in computer science and a minor in philosophy, and I went off and did an engineering career. I was part of the whole .com heyday back in 1998 to 2000 in the Bay Area. And then fast forward, I kind of threw basically challenges with relationships and seeking to fix something or heal something or get better with women, because to me just intimate relationships was something that never really happened for me, and I just didn't understand how they even happened. And that's sort of was a quest I went on that led me to trying all kinds of things like salsa dancing, and I sort of dabbled in pickup artist world, and I did nonviolent communication and comedy improv, and then I ended up doing this program for men around intimacy that was based on circling and authentic relating called AMP. That was in 2008 where we met. Yeah, and I was right in the middle of a career transition. I was actually halfway through getting a kind of alternative degree in spiritual psychology, a master's degree here in California at the University of Santa Monica. And I've just been kind of in and out in a variety of different ways in the transformational world, spiritual practice world, applied philosophy world. And, in moments I'm like really gung ho, and in other moments I, circle the spiral of my own despair and give up and then come back, and it's all right. Like it's a journey. So I've been at it for a while, and I ended up basically getting into circling and authentic relating pretty seriously. I was part of the founding team at the Integral Center in Boulder. I worked there. I basically ended up becoming the director of trainings and faculty development. I started to design my own kind of deep dive intensive trainings. I created one called the Authentic Relating Comprehensive, which was kind of a predecessor to what I'm up to now, which is my own branded form of authentic relating called meta relating, specifically designed for organizations, and happy to share a little bit more about that.
That'd be great.
And yeah, some of the people I work with are a little bit more kind of standard in the corporate world, and I'm sort of helping them become better communicators, better leaders, relational leadership ideas. I work with them on that. Sort of like it's almost like a form of executive coaching that's sort of focused on the relational dimension.
Right.
And then other clients I work with are like transformational leaders who are themselves, trying to create organizations, trying to create an educational pathway. And there's like the complications of like making money and having an intentional culture where people, they want to bring their whole selves to wherever, whatever's happening, and they have all these tools for it. And it's sort of like, if conventional corporate world is sort of like, people sort of check their heart at the door and put on their public personas, and they come in and they do all of their deep and meaningful, like on the weekends at church or in their, privacy of their own homes. Building organizations in transformational world is totally different. Everyone wants to be like, my feelings and my wants and my desires and my hopes and my purpose. And it's like, it becomes super meaningful. And that can be real hard sometimes, especially for transformational leaders trying to kind of wrangle,
Right.
students and sort of dual relationships and, faculty members that they're developing, and almost like it can almost turn into like a cult around themselves where it's like, I don't know if I want this or if I ask for this, and how do I get them to go away once they're done like learning what they came to learn? Do we really want everyone to just stay? This is going to turn to some multi-level marketing Nexium like cult thing or whatever. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic, but people are hungry for it. Like, and it's in the air, right? Like this, what do you want to call it? Like cult going in, cult coming out. You can make a whole,
Right.
podcast series or a Netflix special about it. Now it's like, oh, it's a little cottage industry of this kind of thing. So it's people are longing for something.
Yeah.
That the, I don't know how well traditional environments or historically that was satisfied, but it sort of seems like whatever was working before, if it was, ain't working so well anymore.
Yeah. You can just give some context so people understand. So it's funny as you're talking about this, I'm imagining you at the Integral Center, right? And so the Integral Center, just to give some context, is connected to Ken Wilber's work.
That's
correct?
right.
Yeah. Yep. And in Boulder, Colorado. And you started that with Decker and Robert.
Yep.
What year did you start that?
I think we did our first event near the end of 2011, but we didn't get underway as an official organization until the beginning of 2012.
Totally. And so that was literally a center, like a big building, a whole world. So literally, as you're talking about all the things that you're talking about, you literally were working inside of, and it was a leader inside of a kind of a cutting edge organization, right? That, in some sense, really was what we're seeing a lot more now, right? More than it, like, I mean, way more than when you guys were doing this. Is pretty new, right? Which is the culture, like a communities of practice. And so you had a center in which the whole center was around a community of various practices, right? Grounded in Integral and Ken Wilber's work and circling and all that kind of stuff. So you really so if anybody has experience, right, with the ups and downs and the various flavors of this, it's you.
Yeah. I mean, me and some of the other, kind of lifers at the founding, but yes, totally. I mean, it was a wild ride in some ways. It was super fulfilling in other ways. It was a lot of hard work, but I had so many just incredible, some really incredible experiences I got to share with participants, with colleagues, and, just kind of creating what you might say is a little bit perhaps unconventional kinds of social dynamics if you compare it to traditional organizations, but in other ways sort of very conventional. I mean, it was kind of weird. You sort of have people pulling in one way, saying, I want more freedom and we want less rules and we want just more whatever. And like, can we all be a part of a thing? And can my thing be part of your thing? And you guys send me people and money, right? And then there's,
Yeah.
other people who are like, fairness and justice and order is important, especially once you start like unlocking kind of the more, whatever you want to call it, the energetics of like whole self-expression in relationship, which is sort of what the core of what we were up to, as you know, circling authentic relating, zoom right in on that.
Yeah.
And then it's like, all right, well, we got to contain this thing, because otherwise, or at least some people were in the like, we got to contain this thing kind of school of thought. I was sort of like the boss of that kind of wing of the whole thing. Like, yeah, because it's easy to, in the quest for healing or transformation, to actually just go right in and like recreate the same traumas that people had already experienced and maybe even make them worse.
Yeah.
And, if there's no place to kind of catch people as they fall, they'll just out, and they're like, screw that place. That's a crazy place. Let's stay away from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were rounding that up, and you were the guy more with the structural sensibility. My impression was, right. So you were the guy that was like, no, let's actually create some documents. Let's get some organization involved. Let's, right. Which has been essential. So you've been literally needing to think your way through a lot of these structures and how to make this work. And I think the thing you mentioned something as you were describing that is you talked about there's a need, right? Yes. You talked about like, we're all familiar with like corporate culture and the often the deadness and the inauthenticity of it.
Yeah.
There's like a need. There's a need for realness, and there's a hunger, right? Mm-hmm. So I have to, just to give that some context, I really think a lot of this is really downstream from, in terms of in terms of time scales, right? It's only been what, like over 100 years or so, right, since modernity, right? Mm-hmm. Like a couple of 100 years, for modernity. And before that, there was a sense of like everyone was Christian, right? There was a sense in which the culture was grounded in these kind of religious traditions, and a lot of the relationships and the roles were given via that tradition. And so now I don't think it's gone in the deep plumbing of our own nervous systems on some level, but like in terms of explicitly in the culture, now all that which used to be completely organized, right, in a huge way, has just been lifted, right, relatively short period of time. And so I think it's also there's a way where there's what's going on kind of in your and I's lifetimes and at that scale, but there's also a way that hunger, I think, is responding to something that we're still working out. Wouldn't you say?
Totally, dude. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways to kind of get into this, and I like to bring in the historical, like you did, and in some level you could go all the way back and just say, okay, prehistory, hunter-gatherer clan groups, whatever. It was like, the Dunbar number, 150 or less. That's the total number of people you knew for your whole life. It's like, well, there was no work-life balance. It's just like those are the people that you ate with and you danced around the fire with and told stories with and hunted with and gathered with and had sex with and raised your kids with and slept with, and that was just you guys. That was it.
Yeah.
And like, if you buy the kind of narrative of, the evolved brain as a biological feature, which I tend to in general, in specific, sometimes I have quibbles with thinking in that area, but whatever. Like, all right, well, it's there's almost just like once people sort of get this idea, well, we could just all move in together like an organic farm, and that we could just be together, and then we could just harvest the food and then cook it for each other. And I don't know, like there's a lot of people, there's there's really conservative Christian, groups in the US that get super excited about that kind of thing, that kind of like Jesus movement stuff out of the 70s or whatever, like,
Mhm.
or like, the yellow deli people with the sandwiches. I mean, there's like, it's like a whole craving, and it sort of keeps popping up
Yeah.
almost continually, if you even throughout the 12,000 years of civilization. Sometimes I wonder, like, if those people around Jesus and the 12 disciples or other kinds of examples like Buddha and his followers were sort of like these, like, oh, we found the special thing, and then they're like, they all just want to like suddenly like be together like all the time because there's something magic that's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And we just keep recreating this kind of like, oh,
Yeah.
there it is, let's do it, right? Like kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Totally. And so, now here we are in modernity, and
Doing it again.
doing it again, and in some sense having, each generation is making these attempts and responding to this, what would you call it, a fun, I would say it's something like a fundamental need for belonging, right? There's a need for like belonging, being a part of something,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And also being a part of something that belonging is inside of something that is intrinsically and intrinsically significant and meaningful, right?
Yes.
Yes. And our current way of doing that, right, for most of the time, I mean, most of the people I think that know each other from work, right? Like,
yeah.
Like people really don't go to church anymore, right?
Not nearly in the numbers they used to.
Yeah, totally. So there's a sense in which, I mean, most people's experience of community, a lot of them, for the average like American, I think, is with their coworkers, and they go to these big corporations, right? And so you've been, part of what you've been doing as well is looking at actually addressing that issue of culture.
Yeah. Like in the corporate setting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, in a way, people are people, whether they're organizing in communities that are more explicitly about belonging and higher purpose, or like church or cults, or corporate communities which are a little bit more transactional, or maybe a lot more transactional in most cases. Yet these kinds of issues come up, right? You could say the entire, whether you kind of stretch it back to kind of like labor unions, or childhood labor laws, or employment laws applying to protect workplace safety, or bring women into the workforce, or these different things. It's like because so much, like you said, of our waking life is in the umbrella of these constructs, that these discussion about values, or how should we be together as people, end up playing out in organizations, because, well, I think it's unavoidable. It's gonna happen. And the question is like, well, how do we deal with that kind of thing? And I don't know if there is really a simple answer. I think it is, in some ways, a pretty interesting experiment. I mean, the other demographic shift historically is most people were just farmers for most of history, right? And now it's like they're not, and they are, moving in droves into large city structures. I mean, we're living through the largest demographic transition in the history of the world. People essentially moving from rural agrarian life into highly dense urban or suburban life. And with that change is not just a way of living or population density, it is this social matrix that people are in, which is a lot of times centered around their workplace.
Absolutely.
It's weird. It's super weird.
It is very weird.
Yeah.
And then you just add on to something like that, just, this year, COVID, right? It's like forced everyone to stay home. And now companies are realizing, right? Oh my God, we don't need office buildings, right?
Not as many, right?
I have a feeling we're going to look back on on this, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be such a huge change. I'm not exactly sure what direction it's going to go, but like just that sense of like that what that does, that shift, right, where people aren't going to work anymore, they're staying home, right?
Yeah.
That's looking at changing cities, right? The way cities are laid out, all, I mean, everything, everything that we're talking about.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if there's going to be some degree of sort of reverse transition, especially as, Elon Musk installs this like Starlink network of satellites, and there's all this freaking land that nobody's living in anymore, right? And then, wait, we could just go out there and get cheap land and get high speed internet beamed down from space. Like, why not just go,
Yeah.
start that giant, collective organic farm we always wanted, or move into a bunker in an old missile silo or something, depending on which end of the political spectrum you're coming from. Like, let's get the fuck out of this highly dense thing, like, and just go do something else. We don't have to be at work anyway, right? We can just work from home. Like, that's what everyone's doing, right?
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's true.
And this is a sense of that, you talked about in the beginning too, you talked about the emotional ups and downs of being you and being interested in all of this, right?
Yeah.
That what would you say is that possibility, right, in which in many ways your life has been a response to, for which you go up and down in terms of it being looking possible or not, essentially, is what we've been talking about so far. Is that the thing that's been calling to you? And what is that thing, would you say, that possibility?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I don't know if I can boil it down to a short statement, but I would say yes, it is that it. You were on it. Yes,
On it, yeah.
It, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And oh wow, I think I can think all the way back to, I think in engineering school was when I first became aware of like my interest in I suppose the logic of social coordination.
Yeah.
Like all of all the programming classes I did undergraduate were like, you're going to learn about data structures. So you're going to make a toy program that just one person can create to like solve the, the programming homework assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Then in upper division, you do this thing called software engineering, where they're like, here's a big project. There's no way any one person can do it, but here's a team of 5 people and you're going to try to do it. But that class is more or less set up so that most of the teams, unless they get freaking lucky, will fail. Right. But they'll fail not for technical reasons. Technical in the terms of like computer science or algorithmic know-how, but social coordination reasons. Yeah. Because it's like, well, I have my code, works like this. You have your code, works like that.
Yeah.
But we try to put our code together and it's like, whoa, there's a whole other set of integration issues, is what they're called. Huh. And and that was sort of where I was like, whoa, this is fascinating. There's a whole sociological, psychological, economic sort of aspect to doing stuff. And that sort of like broadened my vision a little bit at the time.
Yeah.
I just became sort of more interested in the social dimension of engineering at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I kind of zoom way out, I think, that was pointing to this deeper thing that we're talking about. And I just get really jazzed by the idea that look at all these different ways humans have organized over the millennia. Like, it's right. We invented representative democracy or liberal social order, or we created money. There was no money, cave people didn't have money. And then we made that. And this kind of, if you sort of look at it as like an accumulation of these like social technologies that really last. You could have the rise of an empire and the fall of an empire, like Rome. But guess what? There was money before Rome, money during Rome, and money after Rome. That technology stuck around. And like that dimension really interests me. And it's like, well, there's no reason to think that we're done, right? Like that we figured out like this is the optimal way, whatever it is, information technology, or there's all kinds of decision-making methods, facilitation. It's partly why I got super into circling too. Like if I think about that, I'm like, how can we take this thing, right, that seems to like be sort of emanating from these kind of talents who maybe stumbled upon it, like your whole story, you know, and other folks who kind of like have some amount of metacognition about what they're doing, but a lot of implicit know-how that, you know, I mean, that was kind of my role with you to some extent, but to a much greater extent with Decker, just like just observing him.
Yeah.
I'm watching him and then I'll interrogate him and then I'll write things down. Then I watch him and then I interrogate him. And I sort of realized like he knew some about what he was doing. And in other ways, he just was like, I don't know how I do that. I just fucking do it. And I'm like, okay, well, can I create a mental model about what's happening?
Yes, totally.
Right. And then
say more about that. Just right. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. Like, and so this is like my favorite thing. It's like, it's something like experience design or social technology design or interaction design, you know, where I kind of brought some of my interest that was actually stemming from just my computer science background and human computer interaction and software engineering process of coordinating teams to integrate code into this more touchy-feely kind of space, you know, but I already had a pre-existing belief like, hey, once we get here, it's like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that the talented facilitators, coaches, therapists will sometimes say, like, look, man, I'm the magic sauce. You know, I mean, they might not say it that way forward, but like there's a way, you know, at some point it's like, but whatever. And like, I don't know how I do it. I just show up and I fucking do it. And you're like, can it be taught? Can it be like, can we like create a construct that like installs just the right set of like mimetic model in a mind body system that will like be able to do it, maybe not as high as the greatest talents of it, but to be able to kind of cultivate that. And this is the it thing, right? Anything that sort of fits into like, let's find a thing we can create that thing and like at least throw it into a, you know, a tool bag of like of some versions of things, you know. One of my other favorites is Holacracy, you know, which we've talked about before, a way of organizing work in a decentralized, self-organized, self-directed way. Right? Like, and let's go. Like, let's agile software methodology. That's another one, right? Like design thinking. That's another one. Like it's exciting. And I think, you know, we're sort of in the middle of this transitional period where we've like basically hooked up most people through the internet, which has never happened before. And now it's just like instantaneous. I mean, look at us right here. What are the implications of that? We are just at the beginning of the implications of that. And so like to think we've sort of figured out what the lasting social technology protocol stack is absurd. Like most of what it's going to be, especially if you start thinking about, you know, all the millennia left potentially of the planet Earth. Like, oh my God, we're like, this is the moment we're going to be fucking inventing this future. If we don't self-destruct in the process, which is another part of the issue, right? Like,
absolutely. So there's a sense in which for you, so what brought, like, where the finger is, like, that's right on that phenomena is exemplified in these moments where you see people who are relationally can open up a moment that leads to things that are unforeseen, right? Like unbelievable ways of experience and heart opening and like idea transformational developmental kind of openings. And then you're like, how'd you do it? And they're like, I don't know. And but in your dissatisfaction with that answer, and bringing kind of your sense of intelligibility to it, which is, this is where I can really hear the engineer, right? Which is, well, no, there is a way that you do it, right? Just because you don't know what that way is doesn't mean that it can't be known. But if you can crack that code, if you will, right? If you can like unconceal the underlying cognitive, emotional, semantic architecture, if you will, that's going on, and you can teach it, then we're starting to address like the issue that has to do with essentially our survival on some level, like as a
Yeah.
species. So it's like connected to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
That's yes.
Yeah. Like, I don't want to just do it because it's fun. It's fun, and that's good that it's fun.
Yeah.
But like doing it because it matters in terms of something like
Yeah.
the longer term, it's not just the community, but it's the community for the sake of a higher purpose, that meaning, and that you were talking about earlier, right? It's like,
So that's the thing. That's
yeah,
the thing. So
yeah.
what is it? So I'm curious, what are some of the things? What have you learned about that? About
About
that sense of just in terms of circling, in terms of the work that you're doing, the what did you call the
meta
meta, the thing that you're starting to, your version of the authentic relating, meta what?
relating, meta
Meta
relating.
relating, yeah, meta relating, right? What like one, what have you discovered about the underlying architecture, if that's the right way to call it,
Mm-hmm.
how to teach it, right? To what degree that it is teachable, right?
Yeah.
Wait, tell me a little bit about what are your latest thoughts about that?
Hmm.
That's a good breath.
Yeah.
Oh, that one that one had a that one you looked at every direction.
I access keys.
Yes, yes.
So I think there's a few things.
Yeah,
I think that maybe there's sort of like kind of coming up with, this is like an evolution of some things I've thought already, but this is maybe a new formulation just for this conversation. I think one is the cognition. This is sort of like the underlying
yeah,
mental models, the theory, so
yeah,
to speak.
yeah,
And that involves like, well, like, what do we know about the human, or about the language, about the nervous system, about animals, and how animals are social with each other? Like, where is this stuff like bottom out and ground out into fucking reality, like physical world reality,
yeah,
right? And it's not just arbitrary, right? It's like our social world is emerging out of our existence as an animal species.
right.
And then another one is something like, you might call these like the social technologies that are not like hard tech, like a computer or electricity, but like the kinds of procedures
Yeah.
that we do,
Procedural
like,
drawing, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, procedural intelligence, like a circling facilitation method or a holacracy
Yeah.
facilitation method. And this to me is like an external practice,
Yeah.
right? What are the instructions
Right.
on the box of the game, or whatever, the recipe, or
Right.
that sort of thing?
Right.
And that idea has a long history. I mean, even in the transformational world, it's like, when the Zen meditation teacher says, count your breath, and if you fall off, then you start over, and then you do that, and you set a timer, and blah blah blah. You're like, that's a procedure.
Yeah.
But like, the point of that procedure is not merely to carry out the procedure successfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
The point of the procedure is how it affects the being, and that's the third part, right? The being
Yeah.
can itself evolve and develop
Yeah.
capacities. And
Yeah.
this all, if we think of really great athletes, or great dancers, or great musicians, or Olympians, or whatever, or great chess players, or whatever, it's easy to say, oh yeah, well, that person's way the hell better than 99.999% of the population. So
Right.
when we see it in that way, but this idea that there are something like perhaps a little bit more hidden capacities. I mean, I suppose when you get to something like chess playing, it's getting more hidden in there, right? It's not like a feat of physicality. It's just you're sort of sitting there.
Yeah.
But whatever those things are, can themselves be developed. So I call these like relational capacities.
Mhm.
And then there's like the relational practices and procedures and protocols.
Yeah.
And then I think of the other part is, I don't know if I have a name for this one yet. Maybe it's like the relational philosophy or something like this. There's a mental framework that kind of holds all of that and helps it make sense. It helps to explain, at least to our brains, like why the hell you might want to try it, or after you try it and something happens and you're like, what the hell was that? Right? Like this sort of helps kind of contain it in the mind.
Totally. Yeah. Because I mean, this riddle.
Yeah.
Right? This riddle is I mean, I relate to being obsessed about this, this riddle, because I know for me, trying to make something that's implicit in terms of just the way I respond to something, right? Explicit, right, is not easy to do at all. I remember when Jerry and I first did the first, course leader intensive training, because we needed people to help us lead the original circling courses way back in 1999. I think it was when we started the first one. When I walked out and we had 10 people registered for a 2-year course to teach them how to facilitate. The moment I sat down with them was the moment that both Jerry and I realized we had no idea how we did what we did. Right? And I have just come to appreciate how deeply it's a very different skill, right? To actually look at the underlying logos, right? And to make it explicit, right? And then it's not just making it explicit, because you can make it explicit, right? But in making it explicit in such a way such that somebody can step into it and actually make that implicit in how they see what they see, how they pay attention, how they respond. And it's so interesting because it's like, I mean, that process of making that go the implicit to the explicit, right, in that way, it is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do, but it is the challenge, right, that we're talking about. And I think in some ways, my sense has been, and this was actually, I realized this too, I really realized it in writing a paper on Dialogos with John and some other people, where I was looking at circling, and it's in what it was essentially responding to, right? Because circling just emerged for everybody, right? It just happened spontaneously, and people responded to it. It wasn't like anybody invented. So it literally had the sense of, it emerged out of a particular time in a particular place. What was it responding to? And just looking at it in terms of it responding to what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, right? And nihilism and this greater sense of things. And it was through that I started to kind of get that it seemed precisely, it's so strange, because for circling, if we say circling is something like a yoga of relationship, right? Right? A practice of the basic fundamental unit of I thou, right? And I started thinking about it if that happened 50 years earlier, I don't know if that would have made sense, but it makes sense now, right? What is that thing that makes sense? And I think it has a lot to do with essentially the drastic difference of being able to have essentially of the internet and the way that we communicate, to have it, whereas before texting and all these different, all the multiple platforms that we have to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
For all of that, I think the first version of that was probably the answering machine. For all that, if you needed to exchange information with somebody, you had to at least talk with them on the phone.
Right.
You had to actually do this weird, awkward, ambiguity-filled thing called talking, right? You had to, right? It wasn't. But the moment you introduce a division where now you can leave a message, then you can do a text, right? Then you can, and all the multiple ways that you can do that, you've now uncollapsed, right?
Mhm.
The communion and made it optional from the communication, right? The communing, making that optional and a choice,
Yep.
I have a feeling was in some sense, well, one, it's always been, I mean, there's nothing new about this. It's always been terrifying to relate with other people. Like everyone's anxious about like relating to people. People are they're terrified. You should be terrified, right? Like,
Sure.
right? Like there are things about me that like there's snakes in this garden over here that if I knew about them, I may or may not tell you that will come out if we have a deeper relationship, right? It's like, of course we're anxious about that.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if if I don't have to, if I don't, if that's now a choice, I'm gonna do the easier thing. I'm gonna send a text. I'm gonna I'm gonna do this thing where I don't have to do the back and forth relationship. Now
Mm-hmm.
you add that like a couple of generations, right, of that, and then you have people. If you look at that, well, if how will you become a person is through that exchange, right? It's like
Yeah.
how you know that you're you, how you form in your personhood, right, and are known of yourself is through that relation. Eliminating and making that optional, right? It's now I think it breeds a whole new thing, and such that circling,
Mm-hmm.
it happened to be something that's precisely about the fundamental unit of relationship, I thou,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think the success of circling had a lot to do with that, right? So I think circling on one level, right, in authentic relating, on one level it's about the practice, and I would even say on a bigger level it's about the state that we're in, and that that there's a need there that wasn't there before, is to such a degree. And so in some
Yeah.
sense I think these communities of practice, right,
Yeah.
are directly in response to a lot of this, right? A lot of this whole pretty recent like challenge of a fundamental experience of people feeling isolated, right? And even down to the basic, and I'm seeing this more and more and more with young people, right, who are missing a certain kind of basic social coordination, right?
Yeah.
Like just you don't realize this, but there's so much going on in just the simplest interaction. It's enormously complex about how I know what to say and like how to pause and how much distance between you and I. It's like all of that is in the guts of the machinery of our nervous system, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So just those basic coordination things, I'm watching a lot of people, right, who grew up on the internet have no idea how to tolerate that anxiety or to just
Yeah.
basically complete sentences and to have empathic, all of this. They kind of sound like computers. And I think that's more common, and it's growing more than it ever has.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in which I think the community of practices and what you have your eye on and what circling is really, in some sense, grown as a response and addressing, has
Yeah.
everything to do with this basic intersubjective
Yep.
cultural connection,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That has everything to do with how we develop.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's, you know, stretching it all the way back, like I like to do. It's like we are some crazy ass hypersocial kind of animal. Like
Yeah.
we are the only animal on earth we know that communicates with this kind of sophisticated types of grammar and spoken language, and it's part of how we survive, right? The groupishness is sort of required, like in a very real sense. Even the development of the person, like it requires
Yeah.
the interaction,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
this is sort of like this idea of like I don't even think the self really is just in your skin, right? I think it's actually partly distributed And it's actually some parts, like there's some little information structure. Like I have a version of Guy in my head, right? And I have a version of what Guy thinks of Porch in my head. You have a version of Porch in your head. And like there's a way our faces are and our voices are like little primordial computers, in some ways sort of signaling back and forth. Oh, okay, oh, Guy was surprised that I did, or oh, Guy was reassured that I did or said that. And I'm like some almost automatic processes, like updating a little bit,
right,
staying current with like who I am as a person.
right.
And these channels are like part of what this social matrix is, what makes humans pretty unique, I think. And it's kind of incredible.
Right.
And then we sort of build off of that in a way that sort of introduces some chaos, right? It's like, well, let's write it down, right? And then they start writing it down. And this is like the birth of the written logos, right? That correlates with the beginning of civilization and the move from nomadic to agrarian societies.
Yeah.
But what happens there is you kind of like, well, now instead of like, we know everybody,
right?
If you think about where does this Dunbar number come from? It's like, well, I think I heard Schmachtenberger say something like this on another recording. Well, it probably was like about how many people you could all gather in a room for like a big important decision that was going to affect everybody, or a teepee or a hut or whatever.
Yeah.
And all hear each other and be able to hear from everybody without people fucking falling asleep because it was taking too long. Right. And I'm like, oh,
right.
I got it. All right. There's something about the physics of talking and listening that sort of create that thing. And once you have that group size, it's like, it's more or less 150 plus or minus something.
Right. Yeah.
But then, these brilliant priests or whoever the heck they were like, let's write some shit down. Right. And it's like, now we're coordinating, like temple culture comes and people bring their, goods to trade. And it's like, we're coordinating. And now it's like, how do I don't know you anymore. So I now have to like outsource something that I would normally do to establish trust onto some intermediary. And that intermediary is some fancy dressed person with robes. And and they say, everybody, chant the thing or sing the thing. And you look around and everybody's doing it. And you're like, okay, I guess these people are good to go. Right. Like we're all bowing to the same thing. Right. And we're like, it's like a substitute, right? The totem is like a substitute for the social trust that we previously had. All right, cool. Right. And we just kind of build that from there. And like every time we introduce one of these social technologies, it sort of whacks us out a little bit. We're like, well, we just made this crazy ass religion thing, and suddenly we got fucking patriarchy and like more rigid social roles and all this kind of shit. But then it's like, well, but then we're scaling, right? It's like we're scaling because we have rules. It's like, it's a trade-off.
Yeah, totally.
And the same thing for the printing press and all the crazy, witch hunting and religious wars that came out of that in medieval Europe. And then now we're in whatever this is. Like, internet. Right. It's like
totally. Yeah, totally. Exactly.
And something like circling and authentic relating, these relational practices are rising to meet it. I mean, you could even say social technologies like therapy sort of kind of were a response to kind of early modernity, right? Freud and these, it's like, well, the role of the shrink is sort of like the role of the priest, I guess, in sort of a secular version of that. And we kind of create some rules around that. And, we're all sort of for as much criticism as Freud gets or whatever, I think we're just sort of immersed in like post-therapeutic culture. So you kind of layer these things in, but then you have somebody like Rosenberg, right? He studies with who's the guy?
Nonviolent communication, that guy.
Yeah, nonviolent communication. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he learns from Mr. Humanistic Psychology, Rogers, right?
Yeah.
And then Marshall is like, but how do we get this out of the therapist office and back into our relationships? Right. So I think NVC in a lot of ways is the kind of granddaddy relational practice,
right?
Which, tons of people in the AR and circling world have studied.
Yeah, totally.
But then like there's something about, the kind of emergence of circling at this kind of millennium cusp moment, which I think was responding to something even more radical, like this emergence of the internet, because it was the second half of the 90s, right? That was this kind of emergence of underground dance culture and underground internet culture started to really take off. And Burning Man was taking off. And I mean, we know this is the milieu where circling kind of comes. That's where it's birthed out of.
Learning
And it's
that
responding to this changing societal
yeah,
order.
yeah, yeah, totally. And that, so I love the way you just like kind of laid all that out. You did that really, really well. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. You just look at history. Anytime there's been a change in the structure of communication,
Yep.
right? In other words, the structure of when you and I get together, how that goes, right? Our experience of it, the procedure of it, right? Our perspective about it, like how we participate in it is essentially it's essentially if that changes, everything changes, right? And I and it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense if you think about like Helen Keller, right? At this level, I've been thinking about her a lot more lately. Um, this kind of sense in which I think she was it? I think it was when she was like 12 or 13 or something like that. Helen Keller, she's deaf, dumb, and blind. She talks about that a teacher, she put her hand in water, made the sign water, put her hand in water, made the sign water. I don't know how many thousands of times, but at some point she said she got water, she got language, and
Yes.
she said she got the world.
Yes.
She got water, and she got her in water.
Yes.
Water down, not water up, left, right, all the dimensions, and everything went right.
Yeah. Yeah.
She talks about before that, right? Before that, there was no sense of her. All that was there were just kind of fluctuations of of or kind of random senses of pleasure and pain. There was no time. There was no others. There was no her. None of that, right? Everything almost concealed. But she got language essentially. Language in some sense. I think what this reveals and what's fascinating to me about this is it shows how language isn't just describing a world that we already have access to, right? No, it's the opening upon which the world is revealed, right? It's what allows the world to become a world, right? So it makes sense at the deepest level for us to even be aware of being, right? Like,
Yeah.
has to do with language, which is essentially you and I connecting to each other and how we talk. That dimension is though it's like the plumbing of the world, right? It makes it possible.
Yeah.
So, it makes, and of course, because it's so near, it's so difficult to see. Like it's like so difficult to get your hands on some of this stuff. I mean,
right.
And Heidegger was really good at pointing this out. He's like, the deepest, most determining truths aren't what's beyond the horizon, right? It's those things that are concealed in their nearness, right? And that's that kind of place of nearness, that thing that's in the background but yet determining everything, right? That seems to me that and relationship, right? Relationship can be a point, and culture can be a point where it elucidates that background, right? And invites it forward, or it conceals it, right?
Yeah.
It can also, it can conceal it, right? It can, in all the different levels that we do that. So I think that, so for example, I think what a lot of what we've been involved in, right? Especially with circling, because it's like the epitome of this. It's like you sitting with a group of people, you just have the commitment is let's stay connected, essentially. Let's tell the truth, and with the intention of relating, right? And just being with what is. Don't solve anything, and we're just going to sit here and stay engaged and be present, and then notice what happens, and be honest, and all the things that we talk about with circling. It's like, I think a lot of it has to do with people are needing that kind of, in some sense, that deep sense of immersion and like that deep participatory knowing,
Yes.
right? That is the thing that it's like the space of in which how you become a person, right? Is that particular space, right? So I kind of think about, like, I realize, like, oh yeah, circling is definitely this kind of way in which people have a sense, unexplicit to them, right, most of the time, but the sense of needing to just be, to fundamentally connect into that space and open up to that, into that formation, right?
Yeah.
And so so I'd love to hear, because it's also on a little bit like less meta level, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's one of the things I know that you're involved with, is holacracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've been pretty involved with holacracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I've loved about holacracy is that in some sense my understanding is that they take the world of corporations, right? And in some sense, they try to model and mimic evolution in some level,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about this is, like, it makes sense because, right, if evolution is fueled by adaptation, right?
Yep.
And adaptation is fueled by the need to adapt irritants in the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And responding to those irritants, that's how things start. That's the movement of evolution on some level.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what's interesting is, like, one of the things I noticed with holacracy is the first thing that they ask for in every meeting is any tensions,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm not that familiar with holacracy, but I really like that, really struck me,
Mm-hmm.
because I would think about, like, most business meetings have tons of tension, but no one's like, oftentimes there's not a culture in which
Yeah.
supports that tension to come to the surface, right? It's avoided. But
Yeah.
holacracy is basically saying, no, that those tensions are the fuel of the evolution of the company, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think my understanding, and fill this in for me, but my understanding is that where you've come in with holacracy is they've really done that on the explicit level, right? On the operational running of the business level.
Mm-hmm.
However, you're bringing in and trying to articulate and develop the intersubjective level about the interpersonal relational tensions.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack in everything that you just said, from the Helen Keller story, and I want to at least touch on that and get back to the organizational life stuff. But I love the way you described that. I don't know if I ever heard that story. Incidentally, I don't know if you know this. There's some weird fake news bubble, sort of like the flat Earth people, that don't even think she's real. They think that that's impossible. Like, I think it's like some younger, like a
Right.
younger, like high schooler thing. Like, Helen Keller is fake,
Yeah.
fake news. And I'm like, what? No. Um, but that thing you're talking about, something like the Aletheia, something like the power of the logos, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's the wording that is like psychoactive, and I think there's something really powerful
Yeah.
about that. I think sometimes in conventional society, we sort of take a kind of mundane representational view of language, which sort of undersells it in one way. And I think in whatever yoga, body embodiment, people sort of like, get out of your head, stop talking, right? Sort of undersell it in another way. And I don't think necessarily the words, the logos is like everything, but like it's no mistake that this is what in the beginning was the word, is kind of a scriptural thing.
Yeah.
And this idea that, like, hey, civilization kind of starts when we start writing shit down,
Right.
right? Like,
Right.
and but this developmental thing you're talking about, it's like we're communicating with our parents from very young ages, and that circuitry is, and there's that kind of biological basis, that theoretic, it's like the capacity for language is kind of hardwired. And if you're in a language community, it's going to get wired up. And it's so wired up that up close thing is like, you can't not, like, it's like, I dare you to stop interpreting my words and understanding what they mean. right now, Guy. You can't, right?
Yeah.
It's just there. It's like these sounds go into your ears and it turns into concepts in your, I'm like putting fucking shit into your brain, like
Yeah.
with my mouth. And you cannot stop me. Right. Like,
right. Yeah, exactly.
it's
Exactly.
crazy. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. Hugely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. And that idea of like the becoming dimension and the becoming of the person, there is something, because we're a social species and we have this kind of power of language, somehow our ability to do this thing where we're sort of like making sounds and like manipulating each other's brains, we're not just doing it arbitrarily. We're actually tuning, right? We're actually creating a capacity that definitely is that synergy thing, right? We are way more together.
Yeah.
And we are at just the sum of our parts separately, or the sum of us as individuals separately. And that is because we can essentially, using the power of words, like load up an entire social simulation. Yeah. Right? We dream about people in our lives while we're sleeping, or we talk about people who aren't here or who are dead, right? Like, how the hell are we doing this? Right? There's this amazing capacity, which is just nothing short of miraculous. And I think it is actually at the heart of this thing we call aletheia in the circling authentic relating world. You know, that thing about Helen Keller in the water, you know, in the movie with the miracle worker. Like, I remember seeing that as a kid. Yeah. But I have some also fictitious or quasi-fictitious imagining of like, who were the first proto-humans, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago, that were just like, they pointed a thing and they grunt, and this guy points at the thing and they grunt, and she's like, and you're like, oh, and then something happens in their brain where they're like, fuck, we're talking about we mean the same thing. Yeah. What the fuck is that? Yeah. That was like the first aletheia. I like to think about it as like the first aletheia. Like, what was that moment? We both know that we were both talking about the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Totally. It's amazing. Yeah. Totally. It's amazing. Yeah. That is crazy. Yeah. So then, like, fast forward to the holacracy part, this idea of like processing tensions for the sake of a shared purpose is sort of what it is. Now, you can think about that as like, we created a rules of the game, like a protocol for a meeting, like a governance meeting or a tactical meeting. Those are the meetings in holacracy. Or we created a protocol in circling, right? This is how we sit down and do a circle, right? Whatever that is. And then we actually, instead of, you know, trying to control too much what is allowed in, we actually create a really open space. Yeah. Right? It may not be open, you know, circling was sort of weird. I remember, you know, people sitting down and be like, especially at the Integral Center, we had some rules, right? It's like, here's the rules of how we're going to be talking, right? It's like, oh, we're all having one group conversation. We're not splintering off. That's right. We're all sitting in a circle where we can see each other, right? We're not moving around and shit. Like, so this construct has some non-trivial amount of formality to it as a container. Yeah. But then when you think about what the freedom that's invited inside of the container is radical, if you really let it breathe open and the group is ready to go. Yep. And similarly, in holacracy, the idea here is like, no, we don't want to avoid the tensions. We want to surface the tensions, right? And the process of surfacing the tensions is not just like, you know, sitting there in the quietude of our own mind and like talking or not talking, just reflecting. We actually have to put words to the thing. Yep. We have to give words to it, that logos thing. Like, in a way, we have to start creating shared reality, right? And this is this thing that's kind of very deeply intermeshed with this aletheia concept of like, it's not just I say something and you hear me. Yep. It's just like you and me can, like, you can respond to me in a way that lets me know you understand what I'm saying. Yep. Right. And that kind of mutual confirmation is like it's a dialectical norm that allows there to be in our, it's almost like in some other dimension, right? It's in some kind of like subtle dreamlike dimension where we're sort of building together a kind of like castle in the sky or some construct in our minds. We're kind of like, all right, it's not perfect. Like whatever you're building in your mind or whatever I'm building in my mind is not precisely the same necessarily. Like the fingers never touch. We don't know for certain, but we're doing this enough where I'm like, oh, we're building something kind of cool here. Like, and we're like, yep, that's what I'm seeing. Okay, cool. And all of a sudden you start even having that kind of like collective intelligence start to move where it sort of feels like I say blah, and then somebody goes boom, and this other person goes, I was just thinking that thought, right? Like, and it's just sort of like, woo, here we go, right? Like
literally, like the birthing of, you're watching the birth of possibility. The domain of possibility itself opens. It's like that. Yes.
And we have to articulate it into words to some degree to kind of get to that. You might say a certain kind of transpersonal intelligence, right? It's not like the raw, we can do embodiment exercises in a room full of people where we're in connection and interacting with not a lot of shared reality. And it's not like a non-meaningful experience. Sometimes I think there's this tension between what you might say, like the wordy circling dudes like you and me and right? Like, and then the kind of like the feeler circling women, or you were say the feminine principle, like there is something about like, hey, if I'm just fucking talking and I'm not actually in touch with my viscera, my torso, I'm not really fully circling in the most effective way. I gotta feel it, right? Like there's like a feeling. And even Brian Robertson, who is a friend of mine, co-founded Holacracy One, he'll talk about that. He's like, you can actually sense an organizational tension, right? In that same way. It's sort of a visceral feeling at its inception. It's like, I feel something, right? It's like a sense of a possibility or a potential, like a rubber band stretching, which is like, he likes the term tension, right? It's either you want something like bad to go away or you want something new and good that hasn't happened to happen or something, right? And there's that kind of like tension. And in a way, if we all just were nice all the time and safe all the time and like expunged tension, it's not like it really goes away. It's just we're no longer putting the words to it and being in connection about it. We're like off gossiping to people, at other times or whatever.
It will have words at some point, just not there.
Somewhere, just not here, right? It's like you're kind of like, it's fizzling. It's sort of fizzling out, right? It's like instead of like going to the place where it has the most potential to do something meaningful. But that idea of like that dance between similarity and difference, or resonance and dissonance, it's like you got to kind of phase back and forth together. Right. You could even I can even think of like different kind of dance moves on the couples dance on the floor. Like some of them you're sort of like, your bodies are sort of like moving in the same direction. Other ones you're kind of like pulling apart and you can feel that tug on your arm and you come back together. And it's like both are essential to create the dance or to create the thing that's possible from that. Anyway, that's my riff on this for now.
Absolutely. And there's something about that mammalian part, right? That like limbic resonance, like as you're talking about it, you're like, rah, rah, like that, that kind of bodily embedded, like dwelling in situation, right? Like it that then comes up into language, right? Is that part, the mammalian part, right? That's the part that I think people are the most scared of, right? It's Greg, are you familiar with Greg Horiquiz's work? He's the Tree of Knowledge guy. I've had him on a couple of times. He's been doing like talks with John Vervaeke.
Okay. Cool. I haven't heard of him.
I'll point you in that direction, but through talking with him, he's got this really, I think, really cool distinction. And it makes so much sense. where he says, we are, how does he put it? It's like, we are primates that become persons.
Yeah.
Makes this distinction really clear, where it's like our attachment systems, right? I need to know that, like, you love me no matter what. There's nothing I can do that can compromise that, right? All of that, where our bodies open up and, like, I'm accepted, and there's a sense of security or insecurity at this mammalian level, right?
Yep.
And it's the thing that if marriages or relationships don't have that, right, that's usually the root of of all the arguments, right? It's never about the arguments. And then he talks about, well, as you get older, you start to take on, become persons through what he says, the basic, like the social initiation of your culture, which has to do with everything with justifying your own existence through speech and language, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, and that, right, that you could say, that courtroom, right, in which is the process of how you become a person, i.e., I am doing what I'm doing, I'm saying what I'm saying, and I can justify it. I can
Yeah.
show that it's valid and it's
Yeah.
justifiable. You check on it, you push, and that thing is the
Yeah.
thing that, it's like, it's personhood is like the thing that allows us to, we can put it on in cartoons, we can put it on sponges, and we can make sponges persons, like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
persons, right? And he makes that distinction, right, between these two, like the mammalian, like the limbic system, right, in that sense, the attachment system, the sense of security,
Yes.
and then the justification. And when he talks about, when those two things are out, you have all these problems, right, and thus psychology and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which through his work, I've just kind of, I'm understanding what circling is in so many degrees, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's like, to be able to have both of those online, right? To be
Yes.
able to kind of like realize that you're a sensitive being, and I'm in consideration. I need to let you know that I care about you, and have that be communicated.
Yeah.
And these kind of deep senses of care, right, are is something distinct from being a person in that, at that level, right? And so I'm just imagining, like, when you think, like, the work that you're doing with holacracy, right,
Mm-hmm.
and bringing in more of the intersubjective stuff, and the stuff that you're doing around corporations and your thoughts around that,
Yeah.
what what are what are some of the keys to that you're seeing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we get corporate culture, right,
Yeah.
to bring up the stuff that, if you bring it up, there's a reason why we don't bring it up, right? Like these tensions,
Yeah.
there's a big reason, because, like, as you start to tell the truth and you're honest, right, um that can just lead to all kinds of chaos, right? And
Yes.
so people are terrified of that, right?
Yeah. I think we're inching close to some, you know, battle lines and culture war type stuff potentially here. I mean, I first of all, I just want to like caveat, I don't have like the answer. Like, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways this kind of gets attempted. And, there's historical antecedents, and, employment is a funny thing, right? We sort of think about it as a kind of free market exchange, which I think is pretty much accurate. But social critics will talk about, well, is there a coercive nature of employment here? Is capitalism sort of at fault for coercing people? And I love the free market in general, so I don't quite fully go there in that critique, but I do see some aspects of it, right? You can actually sort of trace employment back to serfdom in a way, which was perhaps less voluntary, but it's similar, right? This is not your estate, it's not your land, it's not your farm,
Mhm.
it's not your buildings, it's not your fields, it's not your plow, but you are manning all of that stuff in exchange for,
Mhm.
the the feudal lord feeding you and making
Right,
sure you don't die,
right,
and paying some knights to protect the land and make sure nobody kills you, no one marauds you or whatever.
yeah,
And like there's an exchange there, right? And there's a kind of an exchange with employment. And I think if we get really radical about it, like I think the idea of cooperative ownership is something that puts the capital footing on the same level as the authority, like basically the ownership as a group.
Yeah.
And I think that there's trade-offs involved with that too. I mean, I think there's reasons why, co-ops don't quite scale as quickly as like, free market entities do.
Right.
And it probably has to do with like, well, human relationships, right? It's easy to just like at will employment. It's like, you're out, right? You're a pain in the ass, you're out, right? There's a way to like actually filter for culture fit or whatever alignment faster if you have at will employment.
Yeah.
But you kind of are creating this differential of power of at will employment. So there's a trade. And I'm trying to say, we should like get rid of all this and turn everything into a co-op, or vice versa. But the thing that you're saying, like once you kind of have that differential, but then you sort of have these more touchy-feely, more recent 20th century, desires like, well, let's make the workplace more humane, or let's make it more psychologically safe. And then we kind of do these studies that show psychological safety actually enhances creativity. And I can kind of intuitionally, I can kind of grok this idea of like, right, if you're just in terror or fear that like, it's not like they're going to come around and whip you, but they might come around and be like, you're out of here. And you're like, where's my next meal going to come from? Right. That you're going to maybe be a little bit less creative. You just tell me what, like assembly line, like Fordism or Taylorism, kind of like industrial labor sort of systematized. People in those systems are just little cogs in a kind of a machine. Right. And this is the machine metaphor of the corporation, which still applies in some sectors of the economy. But it really, once we kind of switched to information economy and like so many people can just, it's all the same, right? It's like high rises or cubicles or desks and computers. And it's like, what are we doing? It's like, we're just like manipulating information and just sending it back and forth. And like, everybody's doing that. Most everybody is doing that. And it's not every single person, but it's like, and now you have this weird thing where people are like, well, what about my feelings? Or, well, if I could just learn my way around a computer, if I could do this for you or go somewhere else and do it over there,
right? You
kind of get this tension, right? Where the companies sort of need to compete in the labor marketplace by making it attractive. And like this idea of like, well, I don't want to be around assholes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I'm going to be around an asshole, I'm going to fucking leave. Right. And, and I think there's been something, maybe, I don't know if we're in the middle of a tipping point or like how that's renegotiated. Because oftentimes it's sort of like, well, if enough people get turned off by the supposedly brilliant asshole and leave, you might be going like, maybe we should get rid of the asshole and kind of whatever. But nowadays there's a little bit more like this, I need the safety and I want my feelings to be protected. And there almost becomes like a workplace activism. Like there's a whole kind of unionization movement in the tech sector, which was attempted with Amazon recently, but didn't work out. And like, where does this kind of go? Yeah. And I think the solutions, when you have that power asymmetry, it's really hard to get something.
Yeah.
It becomes like a, the quick and dirty, almost like narrative is like, somebody reports something anonymously and it filters up to some executive and lawyer in the HR department. Yeah. They do some kind of calculation just of like, what's the liability trade-off between, getting rid of this person versus getting rid of that person. Then they decide, and then they show up to the person and they say, so, we can't really tell you about anything, but here's the thing. It's an NDA and here's some money.
Yeah.
If you sign this thing, you can have that money and then you voluntarily leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, what the fuck just happened? You're like, I don't know.
Right. Right. Totally. So
it's weird. I mean, it's, because it's not our hunter-gatherer tribe. It's not this thing where we're like, we're all stuck together. We're in this together until we die. We can sort of like join up and then feel like I'm a part of something, and then be like, no, you're not anymore, right? For whatever reason, you quit and you're like, I don't like that anymore. Or somebody goes like, you're out of here.
Yeah.
You're fired, or take this money, you're just laid off. I mean, at Hewlett Packard, I was part of a big mass layoff of many thousands of people, like all at the same time.
Right. 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 Totally. Totally interesting.
So it's weird. I mean, I don't know what the kind of cusp is here. And if you could, in the world where sort of like the nation state was sort of like the bigger holon, right? And inside of it, there was like companies.
Yeah.
You got to go back to like, the Mad Men era, mid 20th century thing. It's like, okay, we had corporations, right? They were big.
Yeah.
They're probably not like big like corporations are big now.
Yeah.
But okay, that world was like, you could just, whatever the predominant norms of the enclosing culture were, right? Like it's mostly dudes, mostly white dudes, and it's mostly just like the way we've always done things.
Right.
You can sort of reliably make a bunch of assumptions about how we talk or how we do things or whatever. And, maybe some people kind of don't get it, but then they figure out how to like get in line, and then you kind of, okay, I get it now, right? This is what we do. And just watch Mad Men, right? That's the thing, right? It's like a thing.
Yeah.
But then, introduce internet, right? Introduce telecommuting or remote working or Zoom calls or, collaborative project management platforms. And, I was already seeing this when I was working at HP, where it's like, well, we have a workplace with engineers from everywhere. There's Spaniards and Singaporeans and Indians, and Mexicans, and, white people and black people. We're all just doing stuff. And it's like, oh, so if there's less that you can assume to like figure something out, and you're wanting to kind of create or preserve something like psychological safety, because we're kind of in this, you might say, softer work environment than like being part of a factory or something, then it's like, well, how do we solve for that? How do we solve for, our cultures of origin are different enough that we're not sort of just on parity with each other.
Right.
And, the current answer is a little bit like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're just going to like create some kind of political ideology that's supposed to make things safe for everybody all the time.
Yeah.
Kind of, but it doesn't. Right. Except for like, if you get canceled, then it's not safe for, right? Like, it's sort of like there's still this threat of getting canceled, which is sort of like the same as it used to be in a weird way. It's sort of funny. It's like a stick, right? It's like, well, so how much sort of soft emergent culture fit do you let there be when there's a huge diversity versus how much do you want to like corral the culture together to make it safe for women, make it safe for, minorities or marginalized populations. And then, okay, so then how much thought policing or education do you need to like tell people to like make it safe for everybody versus how much do you just give people the tools that just empower them to create it for themselves, right? Which can be frightening because of this whole asymmetry. Oh yeah, you're telling me I can just do whatever until I can't, and I don't know when that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So it's to me it's a puzzle. But like my ideas behind meta relating, like to kind of distill authentic relating principles and practices into a set of repeatable protocols, is my answer, or at least the beginnings of an answer to culture is in its foundations. It's an emergent thing. More powerful people, status people influence it more, but nobody gets to dictate what culture is. Culture is more like a Ouija board, right? We all have our fingers on the thing, and it's sort of like whatever the emergent thing is what it is, right? We all are adding to it. It's like a collective calculation, right? This is the social animal thing. It's just spread throughout all the brains of the people, and it's like whatever the culture is that thing. That's the actual culture. And like this sort of like corporate culture that HR is sort of telling everybody to do is not the actual culture. It's sort of like a little piece of it. Like it's this kind of like group of people that are trying to like force it to be a certain way.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
when it's like culture has always usually been it's emergent. It's from within within a like a an embedded situation, right? Where
Yeah.
what I wanted and what became necessary, when those two things, like what's possible and what's necessary, and how do we do this, and the impossibility of that, and then confronting that, and the things that open up in that in the guts of it, right, is
Yeah.
seems to be where culture is, right, or how culture, you know, emerges and evolves, and right, and
Yeah.
that from within it. So it's like that sense of, yeah, putting that over the top of it, just it's so strange. It's so strange.
It's straight. I mean, the to be kind of gracious to it, it's, you know, there's an intuition there that is sort of like if you're a tribal elder, or right, you realize you have more power or something, you're kind of perceiving, oh, people turn to you, right? Like you can actually check in a circle. I mean, I don't know if have you heard of the whites of their eyes theory? Have you heard of this idea? Like if you compare us to other primates, like the space where the whites show inside the eyes is very limited. You can bear, like other primates, it's almost all black.
Huh. Oh, interesting.
But with humans, we can track where other people are looking.
Yeah.
This is part of that calculation.
Yeah.
So if you're ever like, you know, want to sort of track for power in a group, it's just like if if you sort of bring up a tension that's sort of like at or near the limits of like maybe what's okay or what that group is accustomed to,
yeah,
just everyone's eyes will go to
yeah,
the person
right.
who
Interesting.
has the power.
Yeah.
But we track it. Like we are not even like, oh, look at who everybody's looking. We're not even consciously doing that.
Yeah.
Our social mind is literally
Yeah.
like we will ping and then we'll scan where everybody else is pinging and ping again. It's a habit. We can't do it. We can't not do it.
Yeah. 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 Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Right. Interesting.
It's a trippy thing.
Yeah.
So if you're starting to feel, oh, I'm the guy, right? I mean, this is sort of like the corporate leader, or you know, if I trace my development in, you know, I was just volunteering at AMP and cleaning the toilets, throwing out the trash, and then, you know, I would be like, hey, I have something for this guy in this circle, and I'd be like, what about? And I'm just guessing something. Maybe I have an intuition about that, and I'd be like, nah. What does Decker have to say, right? Or what does Guy have to say, right? But then years later, when I was like the dude, right, with a lot more status and power,
right.
Sometimes I'd just be doing the same thing. It would just be like a thought. You know how we do in circling?
Mm-hmm.
Speak the thought. I don't know if it's real or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's occurring to me.
Yeah.
I'd just be like, hey, I'm wondering, is this happening for you? And the person goes like, I don't know. Is it happening for me? Porch said something. You know, it's like I could sort of watch them like almost introjecting my perspective.
Right.
Because of some perceived power status thing, which was is like a trippy kind of a thing. So I mean, I went a little afield here, but this idea that as leaders, I mean, you know, you're a leader and I'm a leader in my own area. Like it's like, okay, well, what do we do with that? Right? Do we like try to pretend I don't have any power? What's power? No, we're all equal here.
Right.
Which is in some context like equal under the law in kind of a liberal democracy norm, I think is probably a good justice norm, or something like we operationalize, hey, we're all just humans here. Nobody's the authority on somebody else's experience when we're doing circling.
Yeah.
Holacracy does a similar sort of thing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean equity on all counts.
Right?
Or with it, we should be like pretending like there's no such thing as status or power or competence or wealth. Like those differentials, for better or for worse, for good reasons or for bad, they tend to exist and tend to recreate themselves. And so then I can see like, well, if we've got a lot of it, we should try to do something that creates the containment. Like with it, right? Then out of that, you get things like the nanny kind of welfare state, or you get these different intuitions where we're sort of almost expanding on a kind of an intuition that comes from our Paleolithic brains. Like we take care of our own because
Yeah.
There's nobody else that's going to take care of us. Like the rest is just like wild animals and death, right? So we have to, right? Like,
right. Yes.
but then when the we sort of becomes abstracted into this, I don't even know who the fucking person is anymore. Right. It's like you sort of lose, right? Like pre-welfare state in the US, there was like a meshwork of these friendly societies, right? These kind of mutualist societies, like the Rotary and the Elks and the all of these groups. And it's like, well, you knew who you were taking care of. Like the pot of money was collected locally and it was distributed locally, and people were monitoring each other.
Yeah.
Right. Not because like I'm gonna like scold. I mean, I'm sure there were scolds in the groups, but I mean, there's a certain kind of like, yeah, you're on hard times, bro. Well, you can come live here and you can come live here for free, but it's my house, my rules, and I'm gonna keep an eye on you. That type of thing.
Right. Yeah, totally. Makes so much sense. You know, I was thinking about this sense of like when you said that thing about the eyes. I actually have heard of that.
The whites of their eyes.
Yeah. And just the sense of just this, and another way you could say it is like, if you have the most competence or the most power, right? I'm kind of looking at you where you're looking, right? I think probably the person with the most power, is probably the one who principally is the one who happens to be looking at the most ideal, transcendent thing, right? And so that sense of like, I just had this way that leaders are leaders, right? And in the sense of that one of the reasons why they're leaders is because they have their eye on the right thing, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that quality. This is where I've kind of come to in terms of okay, how do you make something like a talent or a capacity, back to the beginning of the conversation, right? Of that's implicit or innate in somebody, right? And then give somebody else access to it or teach them how to do that, right? And how difficult that is. Right. There is an element where you can abstract out the distinctions, right?
Yeah.
There is that element where which makes it easier, like a lot easier to kind of to abstract those out and make them skills that you can actually practice and like, you know, do dribble drills and communication things and all of that stuff. There's another element that I've noticed, and this is what I've kind of realized when I started realizing this in the switch from when I started doing longer trainings, right? Where before that, it was just basically weekends. We would do 2 or 3 day weekend intensives, right?
Yep.
They were really what I would call they were really transformational. Like they were really like, you go into that experience, right? And then you go through this experience and then you walk out and stuff occurs to you differently, right? It's like same situation, same life, but when you drive back home, it's a little bit of a different home because you're seeing things differently. So it shifted how one sees.
Right. That's the changing of the being thing where we kind of
totally.
started out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what I started noticing was the first year of the original circling program, right? The first year long that we did.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was sitting up on the stairwell and I was looking down at everybody. It was the last weekend. It was on break. I was just sitting there, just like taking my break, and I just started watching people, watching how that they were responding to each other, right?
Yep.
And I started to just think about for each of them, right? What it was that they wanted to accomplish when they first came in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then was noticing that not only did a lot of them accomplish that, right? But who they were being with each other and just their relating, right?
Yeah.
was so fun, it was so different than where they stood when they came in. Everything from like the way that they would, like their reflex, where they were looking, how they were paying attention, when they were standing there, the way that they were standing, their orientation to the whole room. You just get that general sense of the whole being
Yeah.
and how they were responding with each other. That was like they couldn't even know to want that. But here was the difference though, is that they weren't even necessarily aware of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I started to think that I was like, okay, I think that's development, right? It's like where you come from, right, is it's such a deep change and a developmental change that it's like it's the place from which you come from and it's in the background, right? And
Yeah.
that's what was compelling to me. I was like, oh, that seems to be whatever that seems to be have to do with being a year together with the same people, right? And like doing this stuff and we have them do practices every day together, right? And they get on the phone
Yep.
and
Yep.
all that. So there's this immersion, right?
Yeah.
That on one level it's about explicitly practicing these skills and doing things that they're really, really aware of. However, there's this other thing that goes on, which I'm fascinated about, which I think has to do with the whites of the eye thing, right?
Okay.
It's like this deep form of mimicry
Mm-hmm.
in some way, which is how we acquire language too when we're kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of mimicking, right? It's not a direct copying, but it's a real deep thing.
Yep.
And I think what starts to happen is my sense of how I've made sense of it is like it's really important what we teach them and the content of what we teach them. But yet there's this other thing that's happening in the background.
Yep.
I think it has to do with you could say, the horizon of aspiration, or the thing that the leader is metaphorically looking out at and oriented around, and what gives direction and sense to everything that's going on. That these kind of, in some way, there's a sense in which you're looking that way, I'm going to look that way, right?
Yeah.
There's this something about knowing where to look, not just knowing what to do, but
Yes.
knowing what to pay attention to know what's relevant and at the right time in the right situation.
Yeah.
That thing is the mystery of how you teach somebody how to pay attention, right? How to get water, how to how to know what's important to pay attention to, that then your communication skills can then respond to. And I have a feeling that there's something about that aim, right?
Yeah.
Knowing where to pay attention to, that I think has to do with this deep sense of being embedded in a situation, in a culture, right? That's happening at a level that's not super, super explicit, but it's the thing that it's like the network of attitude that we kind of dwell in
Mm-hmm.
and become indwelled by, that in some sense gets all the way like down into our feet and comes out in our articulations, and then we practice it with each other and we start to say stuff and people are like nah, nah, so we're kind of on some level honing it back and forth.
Yep.
That kind of, because I think that's the thing that's possible with culture, right? Is when culture's realizing what it could be, right? I think it's this kind of, in some sense, it's a background phenomena, right? Of
Yes.
we, as Heidegger would say, like we dwell, right? We dwell in something, right? We dwell in it, and then it indwells us in this kind of autopoetic thing that goes on. And I think it's like one of those places where, I mean, this is huge because one of the things that's really not in our culture hardly at all anymore is mentorship, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think mentorship is explicitly about that, because you think about like,
Mm-hmm.
I think when I think of mentoring, it's different than teaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more like it's like dwelling with somebody who's good at that particular domain, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, and my grandfather, who was he moved to America in 1928. He was a tailor,
Yeah.
and he escaped he escaped. He lived. He had like 17 brothers and sisters in Hanover, Germany, and he talked about like they had kids to have workers for the farm, right? And so he talked about how he escaped from the family, and he found a tailor who would take him on as an apprentice, and he basically kind of lived with the tailor, right? And he would tell stories about like, you know, being mentored with the tailor.
Yeah.
You really got this sense that sometimes they talked explicitly about being a tailor, and they like there was teaching going on, but mostly you kind of get the sense that there's like the way that the tailor moved his hands when they weren't even talking about tailoring, that there's this kind of sense in which like what the tailor had in view, right, all the time, right, in between being a tailor, that in some sense my grandfather, as being apprenticed, in some sense dwelled in, right, such that he could, and he was a master tailor. I mean, people like flew their clothes in, you know, in the 30s. Comiskey,
Wow.
Chuck Comiskey was the, you know, he was the personal tailor for Chuck Comiskey and made suits and all this stuff. And it was really much about this. Like it has a lot to do with like high level skill, right, and mastery, where there's something that you can't directly teach, right? That has to do with this way of knowing where to put your attention in the right moment, in the right time, having its kairos, and being sensibly open, right, to that sensitivity in that domain.
Yeah.
And I think though that has to do with these deep kind of embedded community situations, right, with teachers in a community that's kind of happening in the background, right? Like kind of like, and you walk out, you have an accent. Right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
in some way that you don't even have to be conscious of, right?
Yep. Totally.
Yeah, dude. What your thoughts are?
There's a lot in everything that you've said here. I mean, I definitely think that there's some amount of background transmission, this kind of osmosis kind of effect that culture has. And there's definitely that social learning, which is kind of like mimicry or observation and kind of picking it up and trying it for yourself, which is different than teaching. Yeah. But there is teaching. I mean, in a way, there is some amount of social learning in other animals, but there's no teaching.
Yeah.
Teaching actually invokes the logos the most out of these, I think. And they're all powerful. They're all powerful when we use them in conjunction with each other, right? That's the kind of like the practices, right? The evolving of the being, and then the meaning making, a sense making of the whole thing, the theory. But I also think it behooves a little moment of caution, right? Like that.
Dangerous too.
You can fall into this thing where it just feels so good to be immersed in the thing, or feels so good to like be sort of like, you know, juicing off of the guru or whatever it is. And it's like, but why are you there? Like, what's the end game here?
Yep.
Right. And that, I think, you know, to the degree that there's like a circling kind of like is right on this kind of borderline, right? I sort of have seen people have guru'd you or Decker or whatever, you know, it's kind of like, oh, but then there's a way that we sort of teach it. Like nobody's the authority on somebody else's experience, which is like trying to instill some antibodies to cultishness. And like, you know, and there's all this weird, even Integral Center and Circling World, there's always this kind of weird thing. It's a little weird sometimes, and it sort of seems a little bit culty, kind of. Yeah. But then it doesn't really share some of the more dangerous features of it, which I think is kind of both its strength and its weakness, right? It doesn't ever quite get enough to like turn into like, oh my God, we're all moving to wherever in the middle of nowhere together, and we're gonna like, you know, whatever it is that we're gonna do. Right. So it's like, it's kind of a thing. It's like, it sort of hovers at this interesting moment. And yet I, you know, at the Integral Center and with Circling, I've always was that, you know, this kind of almost like this philosophical tension between, you know, the people that wanted it to be like a movement, right? This is like church. This is a religion for a new century, you know, and even Ken Wilber talks about like religion tomorrow, you know. And then there's people who are like a little bit more like me. I'm a little bit more like, let's make it more like school or university. Yeah. Like people come, they're customers, they pay, they learn, they get their thing, they leave. I mean, maybe they take a few extra years, maybe they stick around for a master's degree, maybe they decide they want to like, live near campus, after they graduate for a couple of years.
Right.
Right. And maybe a few of them become professors, and that's cool. But like for the most part, it's kind of like, just go on home, because otherwise we're sort of forced to like become this cradle to grave thing that church is, this sort of bizarro pyramid scheme, right? That like, or we just let it, be, and we're sort of like, we just do this slice. We just do this one particular slice. It's relational practice. It's this, it's that. So in my world, I like to sort of downsize a little bit of the relational practices and say, look, these are powerful and they can be sort of adapted and integrated into other communities. It's more portable in that way. But even the learning of the portable thing is going to involve some of this osmosis with the master level teachers, which is kind of like a way that you kind of like accelerate boosts up, even if you don't quite have the metacognition of it.
Right, totally.
But I gotta pause. I gotta tell you, I got some messages. There's a bit of a family emergency, and I gotta fucking end this.
Okay. I hope everything's okay.
I'm so sorry. This has been fun, and I hope this is useful. What we did accomplish. Let's do another one.
Let's do another one. We just got started.
Awesome. This is great.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.